This is where we left off, and we'll move on to the next slide, which actually shows some of the finches that Darwin studied. Again, what he looked at is one particular group of birds, just the finches, but different populations of the finches. And what he found was that each one was specialized in terms of its tool, which is its beak, to eat the food that it was eating. So this idea that this happened, that it actually happened, is where he came up with this. They were all very similar. He could see various parts of the finches that were the same, but the beaks were slightly different, and those slight differences allowed them to occupy that particular food source uniquely. So this is where he came up with the uh, unity and diversity and descent with modification. Your book talks about the bats and with regard to the forelimb of the bat and the horse and the human and the whale flipper. Although they all look very different to us now, they have you can see a common ancestor out of them. This particular concept is supported by fossils that were found at this time and are still being found. And then the finches that Darwin studied were in the Galapagos Island. I should actually say he traveled all around the world in a small ship called the Beagle, a very small ship, and he was observing all the time he was traveling, but much of the core theory that he came up with came from data that he achieved or that he collected on the Galapagos Islands. Moving on to kind of a different, that's the end of the themes, but moving on to a different aspect of this chapter is this idea of how do we organize this? As biologists, we ask questions about life, and so by definition, the word question is an inquiry, but we need to make these questions or create these questions that they are science-based. And generally what we mean by that is they build on science that was already there. So you ask questions about science that was already there and come up with answers and then ask more questions. It isn't something where we'll ever know everything. We actually probably know very little at this time, but this is the idea of a scientific inquiry. In terms of literacy, a nice quote from the National Academy of Sciences: the knowledge and understanding of scientific concepts requires, for personal decision making, participation in civic and cultural affairs, and economic productivity. So that this talks about the interrelatedness of communities and also the interrelatedness of different systems. Some of those are very clearly biologically oriented, and some of them are more how we react with the world. In terms of science and how we go about our studies, we make questions, queries, and that's the search for data, for information that then can be formulated into an explanation. Basically, two types of scientific inquiry. You have discovery science, and you have then hypothesis-based science. So discovery science is where one is going to observe and create data, observe and write down observations in the form of data, then analyze that data. Data can be either qualitative or quantitative. So data generally falls into two major categories. Qualitative would be descriptions, and so if it's done in a scientific way, one tries to take as much of the subjectivity out of it as possible, or it can be quantitative, which means it's measurable, and that those measurements should be able to be replicated by the next person, or even replicated by yourself, in order for them to hold up, to make sure that that is data that is then can be taken and analyzed. That data then that is measurable is generally organized into tables or graphs so that we can talk to other people about our data instead of just having a bunch of numbers all over. We organize it. And what you have here is a nice picture of Jane Goodall, who spent many years studying gorillas, and you have a picture of her notebook where she actually wrote down what she was seeing, and she also drew pictures, etc., about the relationships and the behavior of the gorillas all the way around. In terms of science and in this concept of induction in discovery science, observations will lead to a question that has some basis in what you know. So it's a question based on knowledge, so a hypothesis. So it's a answer. Well, actually, I said that backward. I'm sorry. You create a question that is based on some scientific observation or even some science prior to actually the question you're making, and then you create a hypothesis that basically could possibly answer that question. Now, I say possibly because the hypothesis doesn't necessarily prove that question to be right. It could prove it to be wrong, or it could prove that you have another question, that there's more to your discovery science. With this, you have inductive and deductive reasoning. Every time I hear these terms, I think of Sherlock Holmes, who was always talking about inductive and deductive. Inductive draws the conclusion through a logical process, repeated observations, generalizations, such as the sun always rises in the east. We see it rising every single day in the east, so we think tomorrow it probably will, and it probably does. And then deductive reasoning uses premises, so uses something one knows to make predictions. So deductive reasoning is the sun always rises, so we're going to deduce it's going to rise again tomorrow. But the sun may not even come up tomorrow. So deductive reasoning, and probably that's not the best example because I shouldn't use it twice for both of them. But general premises, so the general premise is that the sun will rise, so we deduce that it will come up tomorrow. We don't know that it's going to be the east, that we would have to observe, but it will. Then the hypothesis needs to be testable, whether it is testable and becomes true, or testable and then we find it to be false. And then it also will make use of alternative hypothesis to prove or disprove the hypothesis that you came up with. And you have a nice example of your observation. The flashlight doesn't work. Then you ask yourself, why doesn't it work? So the observation doesn't work. First hypothesis, dead batteries. Second is bulbs burn out, and both are testable. So with regard to a hypothesis, generally what you'll have is again the alternative, and you might have several alternatives in terms of the outcome. And all of these hypotheses can be testable to find out which one is accurate. And then scientific method and discovery science. With this, what we do is observations and research. Those observations, research then lead to a hypothesis. Remember, the hypothesis is a informed question or informed answer to a question. We test that hypothesis with an experiment, and that experiment has a control in it, has certain portions to it. So an experiment is always set up in is generally set up in a specific way, where you have a control. So you have it compared to other data and other data that's actually known. You have a variable, an independent variable, so an added variable, and then a dependent variable, the effects of the added variable. So you have the independent variable that basically you're studying, and then you throw things in, these dependent variables, that are effects on that added variable. And so you have a let's see, you have, so you are going to study whether bees like red flowers or yellow flowers. And what you have is, the thing you can't control is what the bees are doing. But what you can control, so that's the independent variable, but what you can control is the fact that you have 50 red flowers and 50 white flower or yellow flowers, I forget which color I was using, that you have the same amount, so the same opportunity for those bees to actually select red or yellow, and then through observations you find out which ones they like the most. So you collect your data, analyze the data, and then form a conclusion to see whether that supports your hypothesis, or whether that that the hypothesis needs to be rewritten to support the data and then re-experimented on. So that was kind of quick what I went through that. Those tend to be topics that you talk about in lab and that we refer back to as we are looking at experiments throughout the class. Another experiment that was done that might help clarify this is, you have this scarlet king snake, which is non-poisonous, that actually mimics a poisonous snake, the coral snake. What they did was look to see if that scarlet king snake was actually purposefully mimicking the poisonous snake to make sure that it propagates its own species, so to make its survival a little bit more secure. And so they created false or fake snakes, that a group of snakes resembling the king snakes, the poisonous ones, and those resembling the non-poisonous ones. And what they found was, yes, the ones that don't mimic the poisonous ones were much more likely to be attacked, so have pits and bites in the snake themselves, and so you had this idea that those snakes that are mimicking the poisonous ones are doing it on purpose to create a foil so that they have a better chance of survival. And then they recorded their results: coral snakes absent, coral snakes present, and how many bites the artificial snakes had in them, and found that yes, in fact, it's true. Where there is a absence of coral snakes, so where the coral snakes didn't move into, I guess you might say, there were I guess I'm saying that backward. Where they were absent, there were less bites than where they were present, in terms of the results of that particular study. And at the end of every single chapter, I will kind of have a slide of what you should be able to do. And so you want to be familiar with the themes, the different 3 domains, and then certain terms that you want to be able to make sure you have in somewhat in your head, or bring the questions into class. And that's the end. See you next chapter.